Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, whatever you're celebrating. I hope you're enjoying time with your family or grinding through Christmas and New Year's if that's your thing. As a holiday gift, this is one of my favorite episodes of the year. For the third time, I sat down with Nathan Benaich, who is founder and general partner of Air Street Capital and who I'm very lucky to call a friend. As always, we got into selections from this year's State of AI report, as well as some other news that we've both been following. You might hear that we've both got a little bit of the winter sniffles. It's very cold outside these days. As a guy who grew up in Arizona, winter is definitely not my terrain. But with that, I hope you enjoy the episode. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, a wonderful new year, that 2025 is everything you're hoping it will be. And here is everything you need to know about AI in 2024 with Nathan Benaich. This is our 2024 edition of the end of year, what's everything important that happened in AI this year. I'm sure we'll be able to fit it all into this podcast.
No doubt.
We're talking a couple of days after the OpenAI O3 announcement. And I mean, I have a bunch of questions for you about what you've been up to, but I feel like we kind of have to address the elephant in the room first. The question that everybody listening to this is probably asking is, am I cooked? How do you feel about things?
I suppose the honest answer is hard to know because, for the avoidance of doubt, no one actually has access to this other than, I think, safety testers, red teamers. And the benchmarks were on really difficult math problems and the ArcAGI prize, and then some PhD level sort of research questions. So I don't know if I'm cooked yet in biology. I haven't seen the evidence of it yet, but I would say at least it pours some cold water on the recent narrative that is hitting a wall. I think this is to some degree exacerbated by media who kind of grip onto mentions of hey, scaling is hard. But I think what's really exciting here is that reasoning seems to be making really good progress. So the last couple of years there's this debate of language models are stochastic parrots, that they reproduce statistics and they're just next token generators. But if they can generate really complex reasoning traces that are A, effective, and B, sometimes better or distinctly different than what humans would do, I think that's a pretty exciting result. Now, like with other AI systems, and certainly kind of these chatbot style interfaces, is you really need to know how to poke them and how to coax them into a behavior that you want. And I still think that there's a really big learning slope that's gonna have to come to bear. It's a bit we need an Apple Genius bar for how to make use of different AI systems for our everyday jobs. And only at that point will we know whether we're cooked or not.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it seems like we're still in the regime where this stuff. So I guess kind of backtracking a bit. This is following off of O1, where we first saw this case of whoa, scaling up inference time compute a bunch yields really, really great results. And now we have all of a sudden another dimension along which we can start scaling. And so everybody's thinking about this. People were kind of already focused on mitigating inference time costs. And now it seems like that's going to be even more of a priority going forward if O1, O3 style models are to be the kinds of things people want to use. But maybe some details for us to add here about O3 was that for ArcAGI, they spent upwards of $1,000 or something on inference compute per problem, to the point where they'd spent a total of $1.6 million on just doing inference for this to solve the problem, which is hilariously expensive. So on the one hand, you might think, okay, we can use this stuff. And you said people will have to prompt them correctly and things like this. So maybe it gets reserved for only the most super important problems that people have. But inevitably, this stuff is going to get cheaper and cheaper. And so maybe you, at some point in the future, get something like O3 that is cheap enough that you can apply it with less judgment about what exactly you're going to have to do. But what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think this is a killer question. And we wrote a trilogy of essays on this question of frontier model economics and does it all make sense? And I tried to, on the one hand, draw a simple analogy of if you work on a laptop every day, you don't, and you use Mac, you don't really go and buy this super expensive cheese grater station. It looks really cool, but it's completely unnecessary for the vast majority of us. And the same way, like you wouldn't really drive like a sports car like every day to go pick up your coffee in like New York because it's unnecessary and not fit for the job. And so like even if you had like a system that was super powerful, like why would you use the god god mode for like simple tasks? I think all that kind of goes out the window if like God mode is as cheap as like kind of entry level mode. But I'm not sure, like to your point, whether that's yet true, and it might not be true for a while as we're still in this kind of blitzscaling wars where we care less about margins and care more about performance and market share, which is probably fine, in the history of technology. But again, I think it's a bit hard to reason about O3 and like OpenAI systems because we don't know really what's behind the hood. Like it could be a smorgasm of models that are working together based on like the complexity of the task that's instructed by the user. And so perhaps there's like a efficient way of handling these queries that we don't yet see.
Yeah, there could be. I think this also opens up another question and something that I've been seeing people talk or kind of worry about since O3 came out and everybody noticed these costs, which is there is going to be a period of time, we don't exactly know how long it is going to be yet, but there will be a period of time where the best of the best models like O3 are going to be prohibitively expensive for most people. So a lot of people will be able to use Llama and things like this. And I don't know how cheap like DeepSeek R1 is exactly. I know that was sort of competitive with O1, but there's going to be, for some period of time, it seems, a gap between the ability of the models at the very, very frontier that people are able to have access to and those other models. And so you do kind of see this gap start to emerge, and it maybe eventually gets closed, but it seems like it's going to exist for a while. And so the kinds of questions people might be asking about that are then, what does that mean for economic inequalities, or just like the sorts of problems and economic value generation that are able to occur between those who are able to cough up the money for O3 and its ilk versus everybody else. How do you think through that?
Well, I was just trying to think on the fly, reason on the fly about like analogies in the real world. And I mean, there are for sure society and like the economy is built in a way that, a bunch of services are available at different sort of scales of your willingness to pay. And the necessity that you have to procure that service. Also, I wonder if these really complicated queries tend to be ones that are asked by people who anyway like have budget. Like for example, complex scientific questions. The average person doesn't wake up in the morning thinking about that or really spending their time working on that. But like scientific organizations that have significant grant money are certainly spending their life working on this. So while like one of the big promises of technology is to democratize or to like reduce the barriers of access to like information, computation, and just like doing work, etc. I do wonder whether still reflecting some of these like asymmetries in what people have access to in the digital world is just normal. Like it's just kind of how the world works. And there will always be individuals who have certain proclivities that are more expensive than others, and they'd be willing to pay for, and that's how capitalism works.
Yeah, that's totally right. And maybe another take on this is something like when I was pointing to economic value creation and like the generation of a business or something like this earlier, it's like not necessary that the complexity of the question you're trying to solve or like how smart you are correlates to how much economic value you end up creating. Like probably
Mm,
there's some amount of that, but
mm,
certainly you see a lot of businesses out there that just generate insane value that are, the idea itself doesn't require that deep of like a scientific background. It's just executed really, really well.
mm. Yeah. And I suppose as people get more used to using these systems, like we'll probably be able to like trade off what they're good at and what they're not very good at. And maybe we don't need like a system to autonomously do absolutely everything, or we only want it for the parts that we kind of don't enjoy or want to supercharge or go faster with. And so I don't know. I think this is all to play for and all to figure out. So it's a bit hard to take a view. Let's take a stern view about how the future is going to pan out.
Well, before we get into a little bit more about the future, or maybe a little bit more about like the past year, Airstreet's had a very interesting year, and I want to talk about that. So I've been following a bunch of what you've been putting out on Airstreet Press, which I know has really put out a lot of great essays this year. You had a great chat with ISOCont on scaling laws. I guess how would you describe like this year for Airstreet?
Well, I think for me, just being interested, I think like you in machine learning for a long time, it feels like product market fit has been sort of achieved, or at least like product interest fit has been achieved. So many of the ideas and sort of like excitement for opportunities that I've had over the last like 10 years have really come to bear now. And it just feels like go time. So we're trying to like be present, be like in the arena, as people call it, and try to make some good decisions along the way, and like work with the best founders we can find. And I think it's been for me also cool because like the science and tech project side, which is really like why I do this job. Big year for science and biology. Like there was obviously a Nobel Prize for quote unquote deep learning, Nobel Prize for protein folding, and then also a Nobel Prize for microRNAs, which was like the class of molecules I worked on in my PhD. That was like really cool to see kind of like some vindication on that. And I think it's also been a year of like huge vibe shifts. I mean, some themes that were like totally rogue or not popular for a long time now became super popular, like defense and security being one of them, but more recently robotics. Like 12 months ago or something was still in the category of like hardware is hard, don't touch it, it's expensive, it's not going to work, it's brittle, customers don't want it, to now like, please take my money, basically. uh, and that's been very exciting. And I think this idea of like software automation and like agents has also come to the fore a bit more. For a long time, in the industry, we were like, oh, when is GitHub going to release some AI coding tool? And then it turns out probably like the biggest hit out of all of them was not like a model company or not like a big tech company, but a startup team that just created an amazing user experience around these systems. So I think the other part that I really enjoy in this job, and like this year kind of shows it too, is whenever you think that the chess game is sort of like at a checkmate state, and you couldn't envision any other like way to get out of it and rejig the power, it happens. And so yeah, just trying to look at the present and not take what's happening today as like the final state of the board. Like it's still early innings.
I mean, everything you said, I think also just points to this is maybe a question for anybody listening who's like also an investor or a VC. It feels for all of those reasons like a really hard time to understand where do I make bets? How do I invest well? How do I make good decisions? How do you think about doing that?
Yeah. One of the changes I've made is to not be too fixated or too judgmental about the starting idea in Gen AI, particularly because this is really like V0.1 experiment land, and things will change really fast, and the best teams will change really fast. And so I think I've made some like painful mistakes by overjudging what first demo I was shown. The best founders obviously iterate around that. They find adjacencies around what they're working on that make the opportunity more attractive. So it's really not being too judgmental. And then the second thing is, frankly, like not like kind of de-emphasizing the like machine learning credibility and gravitas that the founding team has, and emphasize more their capabilities in execution and taste around design and product, and like their affinity for who they're building for. Because with these like frontier systems, like the AI space has been gifted artifacts that allow it to iterate at the speed of SaaS without having to burn their entire seed budget on train data collection, like hyperparameter tuning, blah, 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 before they get to test whether their product hypothesis even works. And so I think it's really going to be very exciting to see what products will come out in the next few years, as they're no longer just designed by AI people and AI research people, but they're going to be designed by people who have those problems and are really gifted in building consumer apps like consumer internet services, et cetera, that AI folks are not like waking up every day thinking about.
And I guess like the theory of the case here too about, there's a differentiation between somebody outside comes and builds something that's leveraging whatever OpenAI Anthropic is building, and they have this really good sense of design taste of the consumers in their particular domain. And I think a lot of people also wonder, what if Google or OpenAI kind of builds a team internally to do that? I think the kind of classic back and forth you have about this is small team, greater focus, maybe even greater sense of what the customer is looking for in this domain. And so that's naturally an advantage. But you've also written about this a bit. So one of your pieces I really liked was called Being First is a Moat. And I do think that there's something to be said about just getting getting mind share, getting, what it is that you're building into the head of the consumer and it being like the first thing they go to with a very nice user experience. So how do you think about what that competitive landscape looks like when you do also these big labs, which probably have a greater concentration of ML talent, but could probably also hire some like great designers?
Yeah. So to take one angle and then the other. So, on the one hand, like a startup that's done this very well is, Synthesia in the avatar domain, and then 11 Labs in the audio domain. Like both of these were, to some degree capabilities that big tech companies were working on. Meta had Facebook Reality Labs that I don't know how many bajillion dollars they spend like scanning humans to try to create 3D representations of them, and then they came out with this like hyper gimmicky VR product that no one liked. And then on the other hand, like for 11, Amazon and other big tech companies had text to speech systems, but they sounded super robotic. And there was a bunch of open source tools that were out there, but I think in their case, like we hadn't crossed the uncanny valley yet in a way that was super easy to use. And potentially in both cases, there was like some kind of trepidation, like uncertainty amongst big tech companies to kind of go into that world of like digital humans or digital voices. Like, I don't know, maybe it's a bit sketchy in their view, which was like the wrong view to take. And that creates a bit of open air for startups to show that, hey, it is actually really cool and customers really want this. But then on the other hand, you have examples where like the kind of bigger labs are there first, and it's hard to dislodge them. And having recently like upgrade iPhone to try the Apple Intelligence, I am so unimpressed with what they produced. Even if it's just kind of integrating intelligence into a camera, where they're trying to feed ChatGPT into your iPhone camera, and the UI like looks terrible. It's super slow. And then you kind of realize, like, the camera is not the interface through which I'm going to ask follow-up questions, or something else came to mind, and I'm going to go ask it this, just like I would use ChatGPT for. So I'm like, in that case, like, ChatGPT is basically with normal people synonymous with AI. And so it's really, really hard to say like, oh yeah, but if you want to understand the world around you, like use your camera, even though I can just take a picture with ChatGPT and ask it the same query and then move on to my other stuff and have all the other conversations in there. So.
Yeah, it's I mean, in part there's this question of like for Apple, anything they do with intelligence is going to have to integrate into like the stuff they've already built, and they already have a sense of what their UI is, and that was originally built in a time when ChatGPT wasn't exactly a thing. And so I guess to some extent it makes it harder for them to reimagine that. I mean, even somebody else who is like externally trying to develop how an AI system is going to fit on your phone or something like that, they do have to play within Apple's bounds, but maybe to the extent that Apple has to quote unquote natively integrate this into their software, their iOS, that imposes certain limitations for them that maybe somebody thinking all this in you doesn't quite have.
Yeah, it's possible. At least on my side, what I would have been excited with Apple's intelligence is just its ability to orchestrate instructions with other apps. So you're like dreaming in this phone, like, oh, I need to go to this like meeting. Can you please like book an Uber for it? And then the only thing it does is it opens Uber. Well, like I could have done that with fewer characters. Some things are actually easier to just tap on your phone. So maybe we will get there. And as you mentioned, like apps have to play with Apple, so that's like to their advantage as well. But it just unfortunately feels really half baked and not in a great way.
You were talking a little bit about some of the stuff that was really exciting for you in the research space, mostly with like bio earlier. And I think that's like a theme that we've also talked about the other two times we've done this. And so I want to get into this a little bit. Maybe part one of this that I wanted to get into that I thought was kind of interesting was you noted in this year's State of AI report the way that AlphaFold 3 gave us another case of the bitter lesson appearing in this kind of world of biomolecules too, where instead of the equivariance constraints, this inductive bias that AlphaFold 2 had in terms of modeling proteins, AlphaFold 3 is like, let's just use this diffusion model and scale up even more. And that seemed to perform better. But it was also kind of interesting because there was another model where you kind of had the opposite story, I think, where you still got a good amount of performance with this inductive bias built in. And so the story seemed like slightly different. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of like reconciling those two cases in your head.
Yeah. Well, in the ESM case, like ESM3, if I recall correctly, like they had inductive biases in order to integrate different modalities into the same model. And so this is like trying to like integrate, DNA, RNA, like expression, structure, et cetera. And so to some degree, you have to have like an encoder for each of those modalities, at least a tokenizer for those modalities that represents them appropriately. And then in AlphaFold's case, it's purely just dealing with 3D structure, and so there to that extent you need probably like less modalities to feed into it. But I think it's still very experimental. And my bet for like next year is we'll see some even more exciting results from scaling different aspects of model development in bio. And I think a lot of the lessons that we've learned in language are actually applicable, which to me is like quite astounding, because in language you can perfectly perceive like the input and the output, and then you can reason and say like, yeah, this is good or this is bad, and you're not really integrating across like, I guess, lots of like hidden or unknown states, apart from, of course, if you're like, I don't know, asking a model to reason about the universe and somehow like, I don't know, it's making a bunch of intellectual leaps there. But with biology, like you know the amino acid sequence, and you're trying to predict a 3D structure, and there's all sorts of like quantum stuff that's happening inside a cell that like dictates how that protein will take shape, and whether that shape will be static or whether it'll wiggle around, and to what extent it denatures and forms complexes with other proteins. And it's just kind of wild the model can learn that. And it's not immediately clear to me how you actually properly integrate across all sorts of modalities, from like genomics to imaging to like cell behaviors into a single system. But it'll be exciting to see the results, because people are trying.
Do you want to speak to, like, you gave the example with ESM and how it's using different modalities? Like, do you have any sense of what you think, like, the most promising directions are?
I think for starters, like using what we've learned in language models would be really helpful. So, like direct preference learning, DPO, is useful. Like scaling up pre-training, scaling up like alignment, figuring out what that even means for your use case. I think in some areas of biology it might be useful to have different modalities, because, like, as an example, in medical imaging, there was evidence that deep learning classifiers could detect disease in images really well, but then when you did feature interpretability, it would like find some weird artifact in these images that to explain how it did its classification, but these were not biologically coherent. So you're like, okay, it performs well, but it like learns the wrong thing. So is it actually like learning anything useful? Whereas potentially like integrating different modalities into that system might give it more help, like a better scaffold to make like more scientifically sound predictions. But one of the other things I remember was at NeurIPS when Ilya said like pre-training is over, etc. A bunch of the BioML crowd on Twitter were like, yeah, maybe in language, but definitely not the case in biology. We've got like loads of tokens we're not taking advantage of.
Yeah. When you hear Ilya say something like that, I feel like some of the theories that float around are like, this is motivated reasoning, because of the new thing he's doing. What goes on in your head when you hear somebody saying something like that?
Yeah, my main question is to people who take it at face value is like, do you understand the incentives of the person that's saying these things? Either way, and I think it's really hard to take people at face value unless you really know that. But like, I mean, the guy is obviously brilliant, so it's probably not entirely bullshit, but it might not also be gospel either. So.
Maybe a slightly stretched version of the truth,
Yeah,
or something like
yeah.
that.
Any self-serving, stretched version of potential truth. Yeah.
That seems like a good way to take it. While we're still in BioML, I feel like one of the important things that you noted in the report that I feel like also makes it harder to evaluate progress in the field is exactly that, like, evals and benchmarking in BioML remains poor. And partially it seems like there's a skills gap there. Like, there just aren't enough people with skills to both like do the frontier model training, but then also like give it a rigorous biological appraisal. You see like those are two pretty distinct skills. I think you see in a lot in academia now, a bunch of people with like serious linguistics backgrounds, for example, who have the ability to like do stuff with these models and then also subject it to like a rigorous appraisal along, lines of linguistics. So you see people like Tal Linson doing all this great work. How do you think about, I mean, I know people are still trying to work this out, and it's been discovered that there were some kind of physical violations in AlphaFold 3, for example, and like Recursion is doing stuff on this. Where do you think we need to go to kind of mitigate some of what we're seeing here?
I think the answer is like cross-disciplinary teams. I think it comes back to education. In a way, it is wild that engineers and research contributors are building general purpose systems and then have to be responsible for the behavior of these systems in any one of the possible ways that a general purpose system can be used. And like that's like a inhumane like ask or or a superhuman ask rather, right? So it's certainly easier in areas like math, coding, and like language because that's what people who are good at AI are also good at. Makes sense. But in biology, it's still not baked into the curriculum that individuals who do a PhD like have to know computer science or have to at least know like scripting or have to know how software works, et cetera, or bioinformatic tools work. So I think like efforts that try to improve like this cross-disciplinary like collaboration will actually do a lot better, and that's probably some competitive advantage that some teams will have because they'll know like what useful alignment means in whatever scientific domain they work in, compared to the average contributor who doesn't know the end use case.
Are there successful examples of this right now that you're seeing? Like I see them, Recursion and some of the folks that kind of you're in contact with seem to be doing a pretty good job of like putting bio people, tech people together. Like what does it look like to do that well?
Yeah, so I think like Recursion does a fantastic job of that because they have very strong biologists. They have the experimental infrastructure from their company, and then they acquired Valence, one of our portfolio companies that's really strong in generative modeling, and like everybody works together in a cross disciplinary way. And in that setting, it helps to have both the dry lab, as they call it, and the wet lab under the same roof, so you can troubleshoot things. In the earlier stage startup side, like I think the folks at Profluent, which is another team that we work with on AI and protein engineering, like do a fantastic job there as well. Like they're really at the frontier on the modeling side and at the frontier on the biological side too. And like it shows, like in the board meetings, like we spend a good amount of time like peering into like the experiments that they've run and like thinking, hey, like there's actually not that many groups that are really like pushing the frontier here in AI and bio like we are, and like we can do that because we have kind of both teams that really sit in the same office and like take each other's contributions seriously and troubleshoot things together. So I think the best companies really understand that there's data and then there's data that's actually natively useful for what you want to train a model to do. And certainly like in experimental biology, there's data that's fit for purpose for machine learning, and then there's just data that's useful for people to look at. And without wanting to like ramble too much on this, but like most of the biological data we've been creating has been built and represented to be interpreted by humans. And I think one of the interesting examples here at Recursion, and they've been public about this, is like the company started by doing what's called cell painting, which is basically trying to like kind of do image recognition, detect things in cells, and like label them fluorescently or project a label on it so humans can look at it and like identify things. And to do that, you need to like fluorescently label proteins, label cells, so people can make that interpretation. But it turns out, like after many years now, that they have AI systems that can perform equally well without the cells having been stained fluorescently at all. So like now they just use bright field, which as a human looking at a bright field image, you just see like structure. You see like the boundaries of cells, you maybe see the nucleus, but like I can't see anything more than that, but like a machine can. And so like who cares if a human can't see it? Like if a machine can see it and that's useful, like great.
Yeah, it's almost taking what we were talking about earlier. There's always been a sense, or we've often seen the case of like spurious artifacts that these things are kind of like latching onto in order to make classifications. So that's also the sort of thing that you can use if you're really careful about it towards a more positive purpose.
Mm-hmm. So we're yet to really see what fruits that brings because it's still early days. but I think it's so far been like a pretty exciting like trajectory.
Yeah, I guess we've gone over like a couple of things about this. We talked briefly about genome design. Is there anything that you feel in the BioML space that isn't on people's radar so much that they should be paying more attention to?
Well, I'd say still like gene editing is pretty amazing. Like we do actually have two approved medicines now in the U.S. and in the U.K. for sickle cell anemia, and there is evidence you can do gene editing like in vivo, so in a human patient, like by just swallowing medicine, and I think that's pretty incredible. The other area is like cancer vaccines or like personalized cancer vaccines. So this is the idea that basically a cancer like has a bunch of mutations, and as a result of its mutations, it expresses certain proteins on the surface of its cells that are not normal. And a personalized cancer vaccine basically rests on sequencing a patient's tumor, figuring out the mutations that are in the tumor, and then predicting what weird antigens or antibodies rather are on the cell surface, and then designing mRNAs that produce antigens against those antibodies in a cocktail format. So it's like you predict all the weird antigens, and then you stack rank the most popular ones, basically, and then you make mRNAs for all of them. You put it in a cocktail and you jab that into a patient, and that's personalized. And you have Moderna and BioNTech that are working on this, and like the early results seem pretty interesting. And given also like the success of mRNA for COVID, like we know that for tumors that are, or at least diseases that are, easy to deliver to, this stuff could really work. I feel like people are not really talking about that enough, and it seems like pretty magical that it works. And this also rests on machine learning to make those predictions from genetic mutations.
That's a really exciting direction. Yeah. I want to get into a couple of more themes on research. And I feel like both of these are kind of wrapped into a bit of the like AGI esque discourse. And I guess that's kind of come back to us with O3. And the two of them are like general architectural innovations along the lines of what DeepSeek has been doing. And they put out some really, really interesting stuff this year, as well as like open endedness as kind of a broad theme. Before we get into these, though, with the theme of like quote unquote AGI being a thing again, and this also came up in your discussion with IsoCont about, models for coding and things like this and what that looks like. What's your reaction when you hear people like talking about AGI? Like what is your personal orientation towards that as like a term and a concept?
It just feels like an ever changing yardstick. But what I think about is, a system that can like autonomously uh, conduct and solve tasks that are like economically useful at a level that's the same or better than humans. I'd say for certain things, like it does seem like we have AGI in like a narrow domain. Like a system can definitely do web search and web summarization better than I can. uh, you know, um, and some of the complex reasoning seems pretty nuts. Like, I mean, the math problems that it can solve is like was way better than what I can do. So, like, from my vantage point, that's like AGI and math for me. But I think so the other aspect of this is uh, just how quickly like technology diffuses amongst society, and I've always felt like the discourse of AGI kind of presumes that once we have it, like it's like a light bulb switch that like you switch it on, and then now the world's like totally different because you can see in the dark, and you can't go back. But I feel like in reality, technology diffuses way slower than that, um, because we have tools that are available to solve all sorts of problems, but a lot of the time like industries that have those problems don't want to adopt them because of like human inertia or like refusal to change, or I don't know what, like regulatory compliance, or just like the how things work or culture. It seems like it's only recently that Sam Altman like now acknowledges and says it publicly that like, yeah, actually like inertia is quite big amongst humans, and so we might have AGI, but it'll take a while to diffuse. And so in that sense, I think it'll take a while for us to all appreciate like, yes, we have achieved AGI.
I feel like the quotation I keep hearing from Altman is something like AGI is going to arrive a lot sooner than people think, and it will matter a lot less than people think. And I think that also wraps into one of the really interesting. I know we're jumping ahead a bit, but just because it seems related, there was a paper from economist Siri Nakamoglu this year that argued that the impact of AGI on like general economic productivity, and I think this was, I forget what the measure is called, but like the measure of increase in economic productivity that is not due to just capital inputs like labor and things of that nature, would be less than 0.55%. And I remember that paper got a lot of criticism. So I guess like the question here is, I see on the one end, like I don't know exactly where Altman is, but it sounds like, like there's like analogies between what he's saying and what Akamoglu is saying. On the other hand, you do have a lot of people, I mean, this is like terminally online Twitter people kind of thinking about the fast takeoff scenario and like everything being exponential. And now that we have O3, people are taking this as like further evidence to that point. And so there's this additional rush of kind of proclaimed urgency about needing to answer lots of questions about AI safety and things like this. And I mean, it's hard for us to just kind of like sit here and armchair philosophize about what's really happening here. Like we know better than everybody else. But where do you feel skeptical? What feels more resonant to you when you read things like this?
Yeah, I think people's views are definitely shaped by the environment that they work in or that they evolve in, and I can certainly believe that, if you're at the epicenter of all this action and this is all you live and breathe and read about, that your worldview is shaped by that, and your timelines for acceleration are way faster than somebody who, I don't know, lives in a completely different part of the world that like can't even transfer money online because of some like BS. And so it's like like certainly a gradation of problems, that alter your worldview. I think mine's like somewhat in the middle. Like I do think that a lot of tasks that are done on a computer that like a human can say are good or bad, and there's enough evidence for how people like do that task, like eventually that'll get solved pretty fast. Once you get into the behavior of swapping your workflow from doing it manually to getting a machine to do it, like you're not really going back. As an example, if you wanted to narrate an article, like you had to sit there in front of your computer, and like when the siren outside went off, you're like, oh crap, I gotta start again. Like when your neighbor's like kid is crying, you have to stop and start again. And like, I mean, it takes you like hours to do all this. And now when you have a voice clone, I mean, it's 95% good. So like, why would I ever read a piece of text again? And I was watching like House of Cards again last night, like episode
Oh,
one,
nice.
season one, and or something. And I remember like in the newsroom of like the Washington whatever paper, and like all these people bashing keyboards to write articles. I'm like, oh my god, this looks like back in like Turing days. Like why are people doing this?
Yeah, it'll
Uh,
feel that way.
so I think the stuff like creeps up on you, and it creeps up on some people way faster than others, but eventually it does. And then you kind of look back at the last 10 years and you're like, Jesus Christ, like how far have we come? And a lot of the tools that we take for granted today, I think you showed to somebody 10 years ago and they'd say it's magic for sure.
Yeah, and I think some of what you said points to, again, that case of like differential economic impact, right? I mean, early adopters and regions where people are way more tech forward, the San Franciscos of the world are probably going to experience like visions of what this change looks like a lot more quickly than places that are not like able to put up, a gigawatt nuclear power plant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or of the volition to change. There's plenty of like organizations that I think could operate way better by just, I mean, using better software, and they still don't want to do it, and I don't understand why. So
Yeah,
it really is like a mentality thing. So I think some industries are just still like in dinosaur land, and eventually like the meteor will strike, and then things will change.
yeah. I mean, it's still the question of like tech diffusion is hard, right? It's like, yeah, the meteor strikes, but then where does all the residue go? Do people
Yeah,
actually like pick up on things as fast as we
yeah.
think they will or hope they will?
I think it has to be. It has to be like out of curiosity and willingness and desire to like improve and be at the frontier, or like existential dread.
Yeah, that seems right. And I mean, I guess like I wonder how much it's a question of everybody says this industrial revolution is going to be different. But in
Yeah.
some ways, it does feel like the potential economic gap that could arise from, some people embracing this technology and then other people not embracing this sort of technology. It does feel like wider than before.
Yeah. But it probably has to be relatable. Like if Google is like going to make a ton more profits, like does HSBC care? Or, does like Wells Fargo care? Like, I don't know.
Probably not.
So it has to be somebody relatable, like in that industry, that really shows like, hey, like, customers are getting rinsed because like the service is bad and it's too expensive and it could be a lot better. And then you see wholesale, like hopefully a wholesale movement of customers with their feet. Right? And I think that's certainly, I use the banking one because I think that's one that certainly happened over the last like 10 years. I mean, like starting to work in London, like where it's a big financial center, like so many people work in banking and the service sucks. And then you have like Revolut and Monzo and Wise. They're like, hey, we can do this better. Like in part because there was some good like government regulation to create sandboxes for like new actors to go and try to start financial institutions. And now you're like, oh, I can't use like Revolut, or I can't use like one of the other neobanks. Like it's really painful.
Mm. I want to step back into the like how we get here question to the two topics I mentioned earlier. I'm thinking maybe we should start with like DeepSeek and what they're doing, since that's kind of closer to the status quo right now, and then kind of get into open-endedness, which I think is like very both like technically but also kind of philosophically interesting for lots and lots of reasons. But DeepSeek, I mean, super interesting. They came out with DeepSeek MOE this year. There was R1 competitive with O1, their coder model. And we've both read, I think, the translation of the interview with Lian Wenfeng, their CEO, which had like a ton of really interesting insights. One of the things I think he pointed out, like he sort of, just to give people background on this, and I'll like post a link to the translation and the show notes for this, but a couple of things kind of came out with the CEO. He's like himself a really interesting guy, both somebody who knows how to mobilize lots of capital and resources, but also dives in and also does the research with all the other researchers, and has this philosophy of just like organizing these really young people and like giving them the money and resources to like do their things, and then they come out with multi-ed latent attention and things of this nature. And one of his points in that interview was that like what we lack in innovation is not capital, but a lack of confidence and knowledge of how to organize high density talent for effective innovation. And this is an interesting differential, and also take on the like dynamic of where is the main innovation coming from, because DeepSeek has been making architectural innovations that Americans aren't used to seeing out of China. Like MSR Asia did come out with the ResNet model way back when, that was huge for computer vision, but we haven't seen as much since. I'm wondering for you, how do you see this like dynamic here? Do you have thoughts on, we were talking earlier about inference optimization and things like this, and DeepSeek has been doing a ton towards that end as well. Where do you think this goes?
Mm-mm. Well, for one, like finance was like one of the first domains where machine learning really had its like kind of Hollywood moment, basically, right? Like, I mean, there's been so many storied quant firms that are chock full of people who would otherwise be working in like big AI labs. And to some degree, there it's a bit similar to big AI labs, where they try to find a metric and hill climb on it. And here in quant firms, you have the metric and it's successful trades, and you hill climb on that. But so I'm not entirely surprised to see cool work coming out of quant firms like on that basis. I do think that the West has like overwhelmingly been pushing a narrative in the last couple of years that like China copies and Europe regulates and like the US like innovates, been the broad thing. And I think it's just probably overshadowed a lot of stuff that happens in China. And also, like the other point, like in previous reports that we found, was a lot of Chinese AI research is published in local language that's not captured on archive, so we just don't see it. And I think the other like snippet that I really loved from this interview, and I'm just looking at it. So like the interviewer goes, and he's talking about how expensive like AI research is, and it's like kind of eye-watering costs of large models. The interviewer says like, but this process is also a money-burning endeavor. And Liang, the CEO, goes, an exciting endeavor perhaps cannot be measured purely in monetary terms. It's like somebody buying a piano for a home. First, they can afford it. And second, such a group of people are eager to play beautiful music on it.
That's
This is like
great.
such classic, like beautiful way of like phrasing things from the Chinese, so I really like that. There is like definitely an art to all this. And then we also put in the report, but like it's pretty amazing how there was very little, if anything, like open source contribution from Chinese groups in the last 24 months outside of the previous 12. So it's like really just kicked off. And it's a bit perplexing to know exactly why. I think probably the best bet is like these individuals would also be happy to come to the US if they could, and they might be able to, and to retain them locally. Like this is the way you have to operate. But it's been cool to see. Like it certainly shook up the status quo. So like back to what we were talking about all the way at the start. Like when you think the status quo is fixed, like it's probably up for a rejig.
Yeah, I mean the nationalism question that you're kind of poking at there is interesting, and like Lian Wangfeng himself was like entirely educated in China, and it sounds like there is that sense of like wanting to cultivate homegrown talent. And this kind of ties into something that we're probably going to get into later with Jensen Huang's comment of like every country having like a national LLM. And like Ian Hogarth, who used to work with you on the State of AI report, had that really great article about AI nationalism a couple of years back. And so it feels like we're seeing this kind of thing like intensified.
Yeah, and that's one also where like if you don't know the sort of incentive behind it, it's hard to like read as to whether it's true or not. I mean, I think it's a really good kind of growth vector for the company to be like pushing this narrative. I'm not entirely sure. Like, I buy why countries need to have like their own language models. It harkens back a little bit to some of these European projects whose name I'm now blanking on, but one was like, hey, we need to have our own search engine because Google is an American company and it's not going to retrieve and produce artifacts that represent the European cultural heritage appropriately. So we're going to like go invest hundreds of billions of euros or whatever into trying to do that, and like obviously end up failing because most government like technology efforts like end up failing. So I'm not like entirely enthusiastic about this idea of like domestic language models outside of maybe like low resource languages, or maybe some countries that have a differential view on copyright. As I understand, in Japan, like they're quite permissive over copyright. These are one of the reasons why you have some labs based there, and the culture is like super different. And so maybe that's like a good justification. But at the limit, I think it guesses question of like what is the incremental amount of new data I can add to an already ginormous pre-training data set that makes the model like that much different or that much better. So it might be less about that and be more about like, again, like this preference optimization and fine tuning.
I want to get into open-endedness in a second, but maybe like a last question on this beat is there's kind of like two conflicting things I can see going on here. I'd like the super high level where we're talking about lots of these architectural innovations, lots of these like post-training techniques that can really improve models and who's kind of going to get ahead on the basis of what model is the best. And, like you and I for a while saw in the Twitterverse this whole like lots of people were very loud about how great Sonnet 3.5 was and things like this, and how it had overtaken OpenAI's models. And like Lian Wenfeng, from his part, is also pretty optimistic about how DeepSeek can compete against the likes of OpenAI. Like he literally said OpenAI isn't a god and they won't necessarily be at the forefront. And that seems like very reasonable. At the same time, though, to your point of like being first as a moat, ChatGPT does have at least the American mindshare right now, like to the point where ChatGPT is starting to kind of become a verb more and more. And so when people think of this technology, the first person they're going to think of is OpenAI just because they were there first. And you might have quibbles over whose model is exactly the best on evals or for your particular use case. And at least in my case, like, I'll kind of move around between models depending on what seems best at the time. And so I would say that there isn't a lot of like stickiness in my personal case, except if, you're like subscribed to Claude or subscribed to ChatGPT Pro. Enterprise, totally different question. But like, how do you think about that question of there's going to be somebody with the best model. There's also going to be somebody with the most mind share. And those models might or may not be like super, super close, but there is like a difference in those two questions in terms of who is like quote unquote winning from a monetary level.
Yeah, I do increasingly think that yeah, if you're not at the frontier and you're not like at the top, like one, two, three, it sort of is basically irrelevant. And I think one analogy there could be in the early days of smartphones, there was iOS and then Android, and Android had a huge plethora of like, or an increasingly large like plethora of devices and that were running it, and you could fork it and do all sorts of wacky stuff with it because you own the operating system and it's open source and et cetera. And then it feels like in the last few years, I don't really meet anybody who uses Android anymore. Um, and and so it feels like at the limit, people want good performance at a good price that's reliable with a nice user experience. At the limit, again, that's probably at this point OpenAI and Anthropic on the consumer side. I mean, Google seems to have great systems, but like their UI is still like unusable, or it's just like unnecessarily unfriendly and complicated. And then maybe Perplexity on the search side, and a few other services for different modalities. But but once you're there and like the service works and it's affordable, like what's the point messing around with something else? And I think if the open source angle was actually so compelling, then you would probably see like some kind of slowing in the revenue growth rate of the big kind of Apple style companies in AI, and you don't see that. Like, do normal people even know how to interface with like a llama model? Probably
Definitely
not. I
not.
mean, they say that they have what 600 million like monthly users or something like this, and I honestly don't know where they come from. It might be from different markets in the U.S. because I mean everybody I talk to in the U.S. is like confused as to why I need to have it in WhatsApp and Instagram, Facebook Messenger, and in Facebook. It's like you're searching for your friend or something in there, and it thinks you're writing a query. You're like, this is so confused. You know?
Yeah, I guess it like speaks to it's like a more general version of that question of like what does the kind of design look like when you're serving the customers. And like in this case, you have a different sense of OpenAI and Anthropic were kind of purpose built for these general purpose models, and so they're building their UI around the existence of that and like that alone. Whereas Facebook, Apple, again, have that. There's that incumbency, there's a lot of money, but then also they have the platforms that they like have to integrate these things into.
Yeah, yeah, or they have to launch a separate service and then somehow like push traffic to there, which the Meta has done pretty well with Threads. But then there, from what I understand, like caters to a different kind of person or like a sort of sub community within Instagram. If I understand correctly, it was like designers and et cetera that really liked it, whereas like ML people are still on Twitter. So yeah, it has to be like a compelling reason to move. It's just like good old fashioned like product 101, I think.
Yeah, the stickiness question is hard, and it's always that like the improvement you get from moving from your old product or interface to the new product or interface has to overcome whatever the friction is for you like making that switch. And the gap had better be pretty big for you to even notice that.
Yeah, and that's the point with being early as a mode is we're in this sort of like generational, for the moment, transition of companies onboarding AI service providers for various things, and I think once they make their decision, they're gonna stick with those ones because the schlep it's gonna be to switch is not worth the like improved benchmark performance, which is not even relatable to anybody outside of like NeurIPS. So.
Exactly. Okay, I guess like last kind of set of things I wanted to talk about AGI related. We should also talk about robotics, but first, there's like a lot going on with open endedness. I feel like I've been seeing this come more and more into the limelight recently, and I think that in general, it's just a super interesting take on what does it look like to build an intelligent system. And we've seen lots of papers since then. There was like a position paper out of Google DeepMind. Even before that, like Joel Lehman, who I've talked to on this podcast, did a really interesting work at OpenAI called Evolution Through Large Models. And like there's this idea of, like continuously generating artifacts that are novel and learnable to an observer. And so kind of abstracting that to the way that we humans experience the world, we like leave artifacts in the world and we learn how to do new stuff. And the environments that we're in are continuously changing. So you're never overfitting to a particular environment. And you have to figure out what is that like common substrate or whatever that allows you to continuously adapt to exactly whatever it is that you're facing. And it seems like the open-endedness research is the area that has this set of problems, like the best kind of technical articulation of this set of problems, in my view. But I was kind of interested to see you also put out like an open-endedness is all we'll need essay. So I'm wondering like what about it has caught your attention and then how you're thinking about its role in like the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's because I just vibe with this idea that like language models trained on static data sets, like obviously have created a kind of shortcut or made it very easy to consume and access and work with information, but without some form of like ability to recursively self-improve or plan how to do that, it's hard for me to see how a system can generate something that's like genuinely new to like me as a user or new to it, and that it can do some useful work with it. Doesn't mean like the former is not useful, because faster Google is definitely useful, um, but you know, we're all in the like, well, that's probably not true, but like some of us are in the business of like trying to advance like knowledge and do new things. And yeah, so I think as a new frontier or as like an emerging frontier for how like software systems can take agency over tasks that we want to accomplish, like it seems like being able to explore, do search, recursively self-improve is like pretty critical. Um, and it could be even, you know, back to like the O1 and O3 stuff, like their, you know, progress like really worked because we had very good reasoning traces for how you know, experts would try to solve mathematical problems, etc. Um, but having a system that could somehow like figure out those traces on its own without having like expert demonstrations would be pretty sick.
Yeah, the self-generated feedback loop does seem like the most important version of this. And I guess we've like seen proto versions of this. So you mentioned AlphaGo earlier as like a very good example of that. There is like the more recent strategist out of Meta as well for like multi-agent games. That was also like a self-improvement kind of deal. And so I guess the question is a lot of these are pretty like there's stuff that's coming to be useful, at least in narrow domains. And I think maybe a question then coming out of that is like, where does that training process, that improvement process meet what we're thinking about in terms of like agents and things like this that are doing what we call economically valuable tasks and stuff of this nature?
I'm not sure. So, like in biological science, it would be useful to have these open-ended systems because like, you can't. Like, potentially, some data points are just really expensive to capture in the real world. You know, some logical jumps from, you know, one modality to another are difficult to make. Like jumping in and out of different fields that we're not experts in is hard to do as well. So it'd be pretty cool to have a system that could take like a starting hypothesis and then figure out, like, kind of roll through what experiments you might need to do to validate or invalidate the hypothesis. And then maybe to your point, like it invokes like a human needs to do an experiment to actually like test if this theory works before you could continue further. And that's probably where like in the short term, I'm more like bullish on this. Yeah, this idea of having like these kind of proto open-ended systems who can help like direct our own research to produce artifacts that would be useful for their own reasoning. So otherwise, it just feels like a system's going to magically like explore the unknown and like do all the hard work for us and somehow like figure out the theory of everything on its own. And that seems a bit unrealistic if it can't like sample from the real world to generate new data points and is otherwise operating on everything that we've created to date. Like in a way, I don't know. It's like in the early days of telescopes, like they put simply, they were like very pixelated. The resolution was super crap, and so you point that into the sky, and you probably can't count the number of stars and planets because you just don't have a good enough telescope. And now we've got like super HD stuff, and so you perform the exact same experiment and you get a different result. And so if an open-ended model is purely trained on data from like the crappy telescope, how is it possibly gonna figure out that there are actually like way more stars out there without somehow sampling again with like better tools. I don't know like how without more information about the unknown it can somehow figure out the unknown.
Yeah. I guess at some point we turn into real world contact and more data for the system.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully not in like a doomsday way.
Hopefully not. I think a last beat on research that was really interesting. One of the vibe shifts you'd mentioned earlier is like robotics becoming in vogue again. In 2021, we saw OpenAI disbanding its robotics team, and now this year it's been rebooted. We've seen Google DeepMind doing a bunch of stuff in robotics, and I think a lot of that impetus has been from just seeing language models and vision language models being able to do things like planning and kind of working with robot arms. We saw various versions of the robotics transformer. Really, really great work. And it seems like diffusion models kind of helping improve like policy action generation, things like this. So a lot of it seems like there was of course direct robotics work happening, but then, we saw these advancements in other areas, and then LLMs and the concept of like them developing quote unquote world models, which there's lots of different definitions of and opinions on. But that really kind of fed back into the robotics world and seemed like it opened up a new set of avenues for things to work a lot better than it did before. But that's kind of my take. But like, how do you understand the arc of like robotics kind of going out of the limelight and then coming back again?
Yeah, I think it's driven by a like on the tech side, the fusion of vision plus language, the ability for like systems to perceive like a visual scene, reason about it, and then pass that information to a robotic system that can actuate and perform the action. So, like for example, like we have this company Seriac that provides like industrial pick and place and other warehouse automation systems, and they have a product which scans every single bin that's in one of these warehouses and tells you what's in it, which is good for analytics. But you can also then instruct the robot system to go like grab things from that bin just in natural language, which would have been entirely impossible to do like 10 years ago, which is like great for just debugging and programming. But what we found is actually like you now no longer have to have a vision system that's trained to recognize all the objects that one customer has and then train an entirely new system for another customer because the systems are not general enough. Now you can just have like one system that performs really well across like all customers, which for customers that have been sold robotic solutions for the past 10 years that have kind of been brittle and like hard to go live with and hard to maintain, against the backdrop of like labor crisis post COVID is still a thing, is now kind of creating a perfect storm of like we actually want this stuff and we want it like now, and we haven't seen that in like a decade, I would say. And then there's like a fringe of groups that are trying to apply the same scaling principles through demonstration, mostly by by saying like it's not like a human wearing like a cyborg suit, but like but basically like commanding robot arms and like demonstrating actions of how you might fold t-shirts, or like pick and place things, and then using that demonstration data uh, to train a robot system to copy that kind of motion. And it seems to be from all the Twitter demos like pretty impressive compared to what we've seen before. And then moving into like humanoid space, where again like demonstrations look pretty impressive, but we don't know if these robots are teleoperated or truly autonomous. Um, but yeah, like across those three domains, there's been a real like resurgence of interest. Not even like mentioning the fact that like consumers can use self-driving cars in San Francisco like pretty reliably and in Arizona. So that's like a pretty amazing feat that was poo-pooed for I don't know how many years before it became like an overnight success.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that domain too, there was a lot of overpromising. With robotics, there's like similar stories to be told, a lot of potential promise out there. Although I don't know, I don't know if I've got the same sense of, I mean, besides like Tesla's, humanoid bot, but I feel like I'm not seeing quite as much of this, this is totally going to change the world like immediately kind of discourse around robotics right now when I compare it to the way the self-driving discourse looked a decade ago, maybe slightly less than a decade ago, but that seemed a lot louder than what I'm hearing from people doing robotic stuff right now. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Well, I certainly hear like and see quite a lot of companies that are training robots to fold t-shirts and like do your dishes, and cut tomatoes in your kitchen and stuff, way more than what was happening in the past. And generally, they're quite convinced this will get solved. So maybe it will happen. But then back to your point as to like who can afford this and how broadly is it distributed. Um, but the, I mean, the other cohort I'd say is, I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier at the start of kind of like the bitter lesson and end-to-end learning works, and self-driving that being true, or you see performance and scaling of Wave system, like the company in London that sort of took a very early bet on end-to-end learning, and then Tesla kind of gravitating towards their approach, and Waymo with their Gemma model also going back to their approach. Um, so yeah, there have been people that have been pretty vocal about certain aspects of robotics for a long time that are now like being proven correct. And I'd say the humanoid crowd like seems pretty loud, but maybe it's my microcosm in Twitter. Uh, yeah, and then that's like not even talking about all the kind of autonomous, defense and warfare systems that are built by Anduril and like Delian and a bunch of other companies. And I think those are all like pretty exciting and will probably scale even more now in the new administration coming into the U.S. So.
Yeah, well, I think we'll come back to some of those things in politics. I feel like we should do a little bit of time on the compute question, and this is more of kind of getting into the industry section of things. So, like we'd mentioned, actually, I guess we didn't mention in this. I was listening to another. I think I was listening to your conversation with IsoCont, and I'm like conflating that with some of the things we've talked about. But I remember you two were talking about just like the GPU problem and the question of distributed training is really, really hard. And we all know this is because of having to manage, like just the size of data centers, the networking that's going on between GPU racks and things like this. And when you're able to grow something or create a system that's got more chips on it, and you've got NVIDIA working on GB200 and it's, that does like mitigate the problem to some extent. And so we're seeing NVIDIA's ambitions growing. We're also seeing some of the competitors. And I feel like I've seen more from the competitors this year. I mean, we saw like the Graph Core stunt. I feel like Cerebras is getting more mind share than I've seen them get before. And like even Salmanova, I feel, has done like a couple of things that have gotten them into the limelight, which is really interesting. Still, like nobody is coming anywhere close to NVIDIA, but I am seeing like more attention being paid to these folks. And your compute index and like what we're seeing on the state of AI report still does bear out. Still massive, massive differential. Like people are not moving away from NVIDIA that much, but there's like more people who are trying to, let's say, launch stones at the giant. How are you thinking about like what we've seen this year?
Yeah, I mean, like it's entirely unsurprising given the ginormous revenue and like software margins that Nvidia is making. So, with like a quasi monopoly of that size, like why would you not try to, get some of that pie? So it seems like the more credible efforts are Google's TPU, and then potentially like Amazon systems, like. But then outside of those companies, I'd say like it's still pretty little impact. Um, we saw the gap, at least in open source AI research papers that make mention of using a specific vendor's AI accelerator. Um, in that experiment, like we saw the gap for NVIDIA, all NVIDIA papers versus like everybody else grow smaller this year than what it was last year, largely driven by like a 500% increase in number of papers that use TPUs. Um, and then on the startup side, like there was an inflection in number of papers that made use of Cerebras systems, but but it's still like tiny. It's like orders of magnitude smaller than what NVIDIA has. Uh, I think NVIDIA annually is like roughly 30,000 papers or something like that, and Cerebras was like 200. Um, so yeah, and then I think the other way to look at it is like these neo clouds like CoreWeave or Crusoe or Lambda or Nebius. Like none of them buy anything else than NVIDIA. So if there were like demand for non-NVIDIA stuff, like they would probably stock it. Yeah, and then just for fun, because like we got asked this question a lot of why should I not like put some money in an NVIDIA competitor now? Like seems like a good time, etc. And you're sort of like, oh, I've seen this TV show before. It doesn't end well. Um, so we looked at like the $6 billion that was invested across like 6 competitors over the last like few years, um, and like looked at the portfolio that 6 billion would be worth today, and it's roughly like 32 billion as of when we published the report, and half of that value is Cambricon, which is like a Chinese chip company that's listed there. But if you bought Nvidia stock, 6 billion worth of Nvidia stock on like the same day that the press release came out that investor X invested Y in competitor Z, that 6 billion would be worth 120 billion back when we published the report, and now it'd probably be higher. So it's like a 20x in, I think it's since 2016 or so, in like 8 years, which is obviously like Candyland as a VC, and this is a public company. It's a. I feel like I don't know what more to say, basically. Yeah. But and the amazing thing with all this is like I haven't really found like an NVIDIA person that'll like kind of gleefully tell you that. Like they're at least the people that I meet are still like acutely aware that this is insanely competitive. Like it's like an amazing reward from all their work, and it's flattering to see that. But like they know that if we don't keep innovating, like we could lose the race. And they seem to be willing to like make bets or build systems that might even eat into their revenue, as long as that's what customers want. And I think that's a pretty killer mentality to have at that scale.
Oh yeah, it does seem like they're not slowing down that much. There does seem to be like something fundamentally quixotic in lots of ways, but we'll have to keep watching. I guess we've been seeing like a lot of collaborations and relationships between generative AI players. We've been seeing various acquisitions. So there is, of course, like the huge Databricks Mosaic ML acquisition. And we're also seeing antitrust come to the fore again, and like more ways than one, not just about AI, but in the AI world. You're seeing model builders and their partnerships with big tech companies, of course, most famously OpenAI and Microsoft. And so antitrust regulators are now kind of worried about where that goes. The Microsoft OpenAI thing right now, externally, and from what people are saying, it feels a little bit shaky at the moment. It's kind of unclear where that's going to go. But the regulators do seem to be also trying to figure this out. They're feeling nervous about NVIDIA. Do you have like a read on where some of these regulation questions go?
I mean, it feels to me like it's go time. I think. I mean, if you want to like kind of consume the edge opinion here, you listen to Alex Karp from Palantir, who basically like unabashedly says like there are nations and countries that'll adopt AI and they will be part of the future, and everybody else is going to die. And I feel like those who are pro growth kind of get that, or that's their narrative. Whereas countries that are more along the like, oh, we should regulate, are just going to miss the boat. And I mean, this is like, I mean, maybe not like directly relevant, but given the sort of narrative in the U.S. right now, because we're all reading the tea leaves, is like what the next 4 years will look like, and kind of imagining our own futures there. But if you kind of believe the like that this is going to be great for technology, great for like regulation and stuff narrative, then probably this holds, which is like the market cap appreciation in the S&P, like from the date of November 4th or November 5th to like a week or 10 days later, plus like the appreciation of like crypto assets like Bitcoin, that amount was like worth single digit percentage points of like the entire European annual GDP. Um, it's like whatever, 1, 2, 3% based on like my back of the envelope calculation. Um, which I feel like is pretty significant. And then like contrasted with like Thierry Breton, who was like pushing a lot of these like regulatory narratives in the EU Commission, then leaves and like changes Twitter profile to like entrepreneur. Just feel like It's just like next level like vibes. And I hear like on the ground like people who are involved in the EU AI Act are like feeling like, oh, we might have gone a bit too far. Um, and probably the EO in the US will get like torn up anyway, and it was non-binding. But given how close a lot of tech executives are with the new administration, like these kind of AI and crypto czars that are getting appointed, that are clearly like tech and VC people, it's hard to see how like we'll enter into like a super regulated like AI is dangerous time. But a lot of things can change because I think there's some kind of opinions that don't really align. On the one hand, like Elon wants to have his own AI company, but he's also like thinking that AI is going to kill us, and um, he's rather like kind of dovish with China, and then the Palantir like Teal crew is very like anti-China. So how does this all like get sorted out? I don't know. And then Trump seems to be anti-automation. It seems.
Yeah. I mean, the vibe shift is like interesting and complicated. And to what you were just saying, different sections of the world and different like political factions seem to have different reads on the landscape. The way you kind of described the overall vibe shift was from basically last year worries about AI safety and this stuff taking over the world to now like please buy my consumer app. I mean, you see Claude ads literally everywhere. I saw one in like DC. They're just like all around. And so we had this, and then like just as we mentioned earlier, O3, there's like more AI safety discourse kind of coming back, but this is more of everybody has their own super extreme take on what O3 means. So it's like hard to fully characterize, I guess, the landscape of vibes here. You can see where people are coming from and why they land where they land, but there's just like a lot of different voices there right now, it feels.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the two of the areas that companies have been pretty consistent about with regards to safety is A, like biorisk, bioterrorism, and B, kind of military systems. Um, and like on the military side, it's been a crazy vibe shift to see OpenAI change their terms of service to then say like, hey, our systems can be used by for like defense use cases, and then Meta like also making that change after they had this whole hoo-ha in China of like, oh, we fine-tuned a llama system to do some sort of military planning exercise. We don't even know if that's like useful or not useful. And Anthropic also having defense partnerships. So I'm not saying that's bad. Like it's probably a good idea actually, but it's still wild that those same individuals are now like pro defense. And on the bio side, I mean, we wrote an article about this quite recently about like, hey, is some of this debate like warranted? Is it overhyped? Can AI systems design bioweapons? And we already have like pretty specialized biological design tools, which are quite useful for like designing, I don't know, new sequences of like anthrax or things like that. But it turns out that like whenever you're working with some sort of biological substance that can kill people, it probably kills you first. And so like the sort of Venn diagram of people that want to kill people and have like enough knowledge to use AI tools to go way faster and have lab automation and can buy the reagents and like manufacture all this and distribute it is like pretty small. And at the end of the day, you probably end up in this, I can't remember like the an acronym of this like, bell curve you see on Twitter every time where it's like, yeah, use some fancy, sexy AI tool to design this crazy like biovirus that no one's ever seen before to impart a bunch of damage is like in the median distribution, and on either end of the fold, it's just like build an explosive device. It's like I don't know. I feel like it's kind of overstated for now, and like we certainly shouldn't be like putting arbitrary compute thresholds on biological models above which they're suddenly dangerous, because that's going to be pretty problematic for a lot of really exciting drug discovery research. And like for AI and autonomous systems, I think like the reality is you need it, because like there's no way you're going to defend against like huge swarms of drones if you don't have something autonomous. Like it's fool's errand.
That seems totally right. I feel like one articulation of how people some see the sort of regulation or light regulation scenario playing out is to what you mentioned earlier, like different countries have these very different takes on regulation, and we can like get into that more. But the US being pretty light on it or sort of reluctant, EU going forward in lots of regulation, although there was some kind of walking back with the EU AI Act, and I know that they took off facial recognition, they walked back a bit to allow this for law enforcement. With China, they've really been doing a lot on this, imposing pretty strict standards and wanting the AI models coming out of their top labs to kind of not look like there's censorship going on, but sort of towing the party line. And one way I hear the way some think it will play out in the States is something like, the models keep developing and then like something really, really bad happens. Somebody dies on account of something that happened with a model. And then people are like all of a sudden, oh, let's actually like begin to regulate. This is maybe getting into like predictions for the future kind of territory. But I'm curious like how you think about the different regulatory landscapes playing out in terms of where things are going to go for startups, how the impacts are going to look as they like interact with the different regulatory environments.
Well, a base case, I feel like countries that are, host to companies and organizations that create and monetize these tools will probably be softer on them. Like it would be so crazy if in the US there would be a bunch of legislation that rate limits how AI can be used by companies and how big like models can be trained. I mean, this would like basically pop the bubble. And like if you pop the AI bubble, I really don't know what's left. So for that to happen, I mean, you got to be like, yeah, like a death wish basically. And so, um, so that's super dangerous. I think it's way easier for countries that don't have an endemic, strong like AI technology base to be like exerting regulation because to some degree that's like one of the ways they could put brakes, one of the perceived ways potentially they could put brakes on other countries lapping them. It's like, yeah, we'll make it a bit harder for you, but it turns out we'll make it even harder for ourselves as well because we have a bunch of other issues that bear. Yeah, and then the other like big question probably is around like just large scale M&A in the U.S. because many of these organizations are so expensive to run on the AI side that at some point they're going to need to have a home somewhere or they go public. But most of them will probably need a home, and if you can't create like a natural cycle of like money flowing through the system, that's also bad. And it's bad for everybody because like if like the highly valued AI company or company that raised a lot of money from like good investors doesn't find a home and doesn't see that money come out, then like that pension system and that university endowment's not getting the money to go like provide to its constituents or its members or its students, and that's bad for the country as well. So like everybody's got to eat basically.
Yeah. I feel like on the opposite side of like a lot of this regulation, some countries are like very enthusiastic about what's going on. So I think that the main example of like a sovereign wealth fund getting into this has been the government of Abu Dhabi. And they have their hands in like a lot of pies, like Cerebras. I mean, Sam Altman was like reportedly talking with them. How do you think about what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I think it's smart, right? Because like, that's an incredibly rich country, and and like they're generally quite good at like finding the new thing and like being involved in a new thing. But what seems interesting is like they're tackling it from two angles. They have one, which is like the let's import foreign technology into the country, which is like through this G42 initiative, this kind of like computing behemoth through which they have investments and bought a bunch of systems from Cerebras and Microsoft and NVIDIA to build like DCs, et cetera, in the region. And then they have like the let's try and home grow something initiative, which is their AI 71 company, basically, which kind of spun out from the Falcon initiative, which was like an open source Arabic language model, uh, yeah, open source project. And they're putting like serious like money and talent behind that, and they've recruited people from large AI labs and universities, like less so on the American side, but more like from various European countries, MENA and Asia, and then trying to see like which one of those two basically wins. But but yeah, they gotta transmit like money that comes out of the ground into like useful capital, and like this is a great way to do it. And then when you see like some of these cloud CSPs like Crusoe that have a pretty cool value proposition for countries that are energy producers and that want to align both like kind of clean energy with like clean energy powered computing infrastructure, like this kind of a perfect fit. So I think it would be pretty cool to see like what'll come out. And my guess is that more people will be attracted towards going to some of these regions because other countries in Europe just don't seem that exciting anymore. Like do you want? I think most people want to be somewhere where like people like have ambition or taking risk or putting real resources into the ground to like get things done rather than like meandering around legislation and oh this can't be done, oh there's no solution to this. Like it gets boring after a while. Like either go to the US, and if you can't go to the US you go somewhere else where like the similar mentality is present. So
There's also the question of like, what does it mean with US companies getting like really, really significant investment from these sovereign wealth funds? And you could see analogs of the China hawks having had trouble with US companies having investments from China. Do you see much of an analog there? How does that look to you?
yeah, it could be. I think an investment of any above a certain scale is going to be like questionable from national security perspectives. Like, why is like a sovereign wealth fund investing in OpenAI when like the U.S. government could invest in OpenAI or the DOE could invest? It's not like America lacks the money or can't print the money, so why are we like seeking it abroad? Um, then there's going to be like some crescendo of like tastefulness where like China's probably on like the wrong end of that spectrum, and then various countries in the UAE are probably more in the middle somewhere. And in the day, like it looks like Abu Dhabi and like the UAE is like a very close like strategic partner of the US, and so on that basis, like there might not be an issue because so many like American venture funds are anyway supported by these groups, and if I'm not mistaken, they buy like all the advanced like U.S. military equipment. So until like that's done, until you can't buy the F-35 anymore, like I think you're probably in like okay land. It seems.
Another kind of direction I wanted to go with this was just like the international environment regarding, like we were talking about the EU AI Act and regulation earlier, and one of your 2023 predictions was that there would be limited progress on AI governance beyond like high level voluntary commitments, and that's pretty much what we saw borne out. The UK had an AI safety summit in November. There was a summit in Seoul in May. France wanted to move in a different direction and called theirs the AI Action Summit. So lots of like high level, non binding stuff. And I think you see, to what you said about Abu Dhabi, for example, countries sort of aligning themselves with respect to what is their stance on AI, what is their stance on technological innovation, like who do we want to attract here? And so then this AI safety question too, and whatever summits you have around it seem to become one of those platforms for, hey, you're a startup, you're really ambitious, come to our country, come here instead, because we're aligned with your values of moving fast and being low regulation and giving you the sort of space you need to do your work really well. And like France is in some sense, there's like a lot of AI talent there. So you're kind of seeing this work out in different ways. How do you see this kind of continuing to play out?
Like, I mean, yes and no. I mean, France has always had a lot of technical talent because of their university system. So many major contributors in the U.S. are French and probably will never come back. Uh, but like the total number of contributors in AI that are operating in Paris is probably still very small. Um, and so I think there's been a good amount of like positive spin and marketing around that, but on the ground, I wouldn't say there's that many people. And then when you see like how politically volatile the environment is, where like now I don't think there's that much certainty over like what direction the country is going to take. I mean, it looked like rosy a couple of months ago, um, and then now with like a big reshuffle and like a mixed government, seems like a complete mess, basically. Um, so I think it's still hard to be operating in Europe, I would say. Um, it's just like easier when you're in a bigger country with like a cohesive market. Everybody speaks the same language. You got one regulator to care about. You don't have like 2 dozen. Um, and still like the playbook is like European companies, launch offices for particularly for go to market, at the very least, like in the US. And I don't really see that changing too much. Uh, so um, I would just be careful like calling winners in other countries like too early with by sort of underestimating like the seriousness of like politicians' uh, own seriousness when it comes to AI.
So I guess kind of what I'm hearing there then, right at this moment, like very hard to work in the EU. Of course, like, EU AI Act and GDPR, it's also made it hard for US labs to launch their products there. And like the UK is definitely going further into this. They launched the AI Safety Institute. There's also ARIA. So they've got their kind of own lab for AI safety research. And it does seem like the UK seems to be wants to do a lot in terms of putting themselves at the forefront of like thinking about AI safety and stuff like this. So do you see that difficulty? I don't see that difficulty of operating in Europe changing for the foreseeable future. Do you see any hints of like a vibe shift or anything like that there? Or do you think this is just kind of how it's going to be?
I mean, there's like micro vibe shifts in certain communities that want things to change, but I think some of them are kind of tone deaf to the reality of politics, and then others are connected to politics, but like there are other priorities that unfortunately take precedence, whether that's education or healthcare, immigration. Um, while like the current French president like likes AI and technology, I don't think any of his like competitors care. I mean, the existing UK government like sort of cares about technology, but I wouldn't say is like well known to be very well versed in it. Um, so, uh, so yeah, and on the AI safety point in the UK, like I would agree with you. It looks like that institute is doing like really good work and got um, pretty high praise from Anthropic for like testing their like Sonnet 3.5 number two. Um, but But at the same time, like, does having an AI safety institute attract like for-profit companies that are going to create like market cap and jobs and like taxable revenue in your country? Like, I don't think so. Like, what would be cool is maybe uh, drawing a lesson from what we were talking about earlier around creating like regulatory sandboxes for new companies to have a shot. And so, one of the topical things now in the West is like, hey, we need to have defense because turns out that if we get invaded, we're like beeped, basically. And so, like, why doesn't the UK, for example, create some kind of like procurement sandbox for like advanced autonomous like AI systems for like defense, and put a bunch of money behind it, do advanced procurements. You don't have to deal with any of this like favoritism with like archaic primes, and like weird political like uh, hoops that you have to jump through and like put real money to bear here and like run actual competitions and use things on the field. Like that would be sick. Like companies would really move for that. um, Same thing in like in I don't know, gene editing. Like we did the approval, and that was probably one of the good things with Brexit, or at least one of the good things that was implemented post Brexit, is having like a separate regulatory agency for medical approvals. And to manage to push one through, like it would be cool if like they got a bunch of like AI design companies to do more around gene editing and created like a faster path to clinical trials and approvals. So I think that's the kind of like policy architected like tech advancement that I think would be cool. Like without being like a politician myself, that sort of first principles seems to be a good idea and could actually create like economic value.
Yeah, I guess the question is if the politicians feel that way and how likely we are to get there in the future.
Yeah, exactly. I just think like the average voter just doesn't care about that. The average voter cares about like, do they get their pension? Do they get like health insurance? Is their energy bill high or low? Like, can they afford school for their children? Are immigrants taking their jobs? Like that's unfortunately what people care about. Like, it's not, is AI going to kill us? They probably have no idea what that means.
Yeah, and I think that definitely adds on to what we were saying earlier, like not quite the same as like diffusion lags in terms of stuff being used, but just the gap between the average like San Franciscan or somebody in London thinking about AI versus just somebody who like rightfully is worried about a lot of these questions, which are like far more pertinent to their everyday lives.
Yeah, and you got to like pitch to the level of the audience you're selling to and like make it relevant for them.
I think another kind of aspect of this is just how people are like articulating the harms of AI. And, there's this differential. So, one of the things you pointed out in the State of AI report was like Google DeepMind had done some interesting research on whether we're like actually focused on the wrong harms here. And there's lots of like sophisticated, really smart interesting exploits of AI systems and defenses against those. But it sounds like most cases we actually see of misuse are from easily available tools. We're seeing like many different cases of deep fakes and things of this nature, and that is costing people money. You are seeing like deep fake porn, which is like extremely unfortunate. And that's getting easier and easier to generate. And so that does seem like where the bulk of this is going to happen because like why would you invest that time when deepfakes are like a pretty effective tool to scam people out of money. So that seems like how things are going to continue to look going forward. And I remember like when there was back and forth about deepfakes themselves, where on the one hand you had this stuff is going to continue to get better and better, but then you also had researchers on the other side who are like, wait, people are actually pretty discerning about what is and isn't real. But it seems like you flood the space enough, then you can get cases where if deepfakes are super cheap, you just keep doing enough of this, and eventually, like something works, and you do get money through nefarious means somehow. It seems like that's the incentives are there for this to get worse.
It could be, but I think we're also like slept walk through one of the most like major political events with like a lot of fears that deep fakes and fake voices and all sorts of stuff would have a big impact, and it seems like nothing happened, or like I haven't read anything. There was no like New York Times headline about anything happening, which was pretty like positive news, I would say. I think people are just like quite good at adapting. Like people are not dumb. But like at the limit, yeah, you could flood the market with all sorts of opinions and things of that nature, particularly around like bots. And if it's in the written format, I think that's probably harder to really discern. I think image and video is maybe a bit easier because we use multiple senses and you're sort of triangulating across those senses, and it's harder to like to fool. But just reading text, I mean, unless it says like what is it, like and then certainly like you won't you won't know if an AI wrote it.
Yeah, yeah, that
Certainly, let me tell you why this candidate sucks. You're like, okay. I know.
we've got some tells now with some of the systems, but that seems right. Fair worry to have. I think we should talk through some predictions. This is always the really fun part of the report. So like one that we kind of touched on earlier already was the question of like investments from a sovereign state into US large AI lab, and you pinned the number at a 10 billion plus investment of that nature would invoke a national security review. I guess we'd already been building up the reasons to think that this sort of thing might happen given what we're seeing from the Saudis. What's your sense of like if that happens, where it's most likely to come from? Like
Yeah, I think based on like who has the money, it'd probably be like Saudi, Abu Dhabi, or maybe Qatar. Um, Not Dubai because they don't have the money anymore, or at least the oil's gone. Um, and then Could be, I mean, other countries that have a ton of cash would be like Canada, or Norway, or Singapore. Frankly, even like Australia, like their pension system is enormous. But those ones seem like pretty like vanilla. So I'd say it's probably more something like Middle East or Asia. But then again, like OpenAI has that NSA person on the board. I don't know if Anthropic has anybody like from the security complex or government on their board. Maybe this was like a bit of a quid pro quo thing. I don't know. But it could be like a newcomer, the one that some OpenAI alums are allegedly working on. But also the other thing is like probably with these big AI labs that raised massive rounds through existing venture funds who did SPVs, like these sort of companies that are raised specific to invest in companies, like those ones potentially have already like some sovereign states in them. So at what point does the concentration like get too high, and then that invokes some kind of like, hey, what's up here? And then realistically, like even if like a sovereign state owns equity in a company, like if they don't have board control or information rights or anything else, like aside from not funding it anymore or actually getting some kind of right that would block future financings or block M&As and therefore be a way to exert like hard power over the company, like they're going to have nothing more than soft power, which may be enough.
I see like a lot of scrutiny coming up. I'm curious with like the new administration, how all this is going to look. I know that there was the platform of them walking back the executive order from Biden. Unclear what their perspective is going to be on the labs. I mean, I know you'd said Trump was kind of like anti-automation, but
But then he has potentially like Elon parroting in his ear, who's very like anti OpenAI. So
yes. So I could see more scrutiny on OpenAI as a result of that. I think another one that kind of ties to some of our themes was one of your predictions was like the early EU AI Act implementation, and we still have yet to see like where how implementation questions play out. Ends up softer than anticipated because lawmakers worry they've overreached. And I guess we've like kind of said a lot about this already, but do you have like theories about parts of the AI Act or things that you feel are like most likely to be stepped back and just what that looks like?
I don't have like a good enough recollection of like the specific terms, but I think what seems like very frustrating is just like you can power up the exact same device in North America and power it up in Europe, and you get different services. And so, in one sense, you're like living in the future, and the other one, you go back in time, and like that seems disadvantageous for consumers who are paying the same price for this thing. I don't see how that really protects them in any way. And like, if we've learned anything from GDPR with this like cookie pollution on websites that make them basically unreadable unless you like X out like five different boxes on a website. Like, and I don't see how that protects the consumer either. I would hope that somehow people can like express this and be like, can we be done with this nonsense? So it might be more along the lines of what you said of like some companies are really getting forward or like kind of going a lot faster because they have access to capabilities that their competitors don't, and then we sort of like call it quits on hamstringing, like European like companies and contributors because of legislation that's supposed to protect them but actually just makes them worse off.
It's like a lot of echoes of GDPR.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask like a normal person what is GDPR, they'll just say it's cookies. Like they don't even know what it is.
I had initially some other predictions I want to discuss, but I'm actually maybe more curious just for you on the side of things that you think have a greater than like 5% or greater than 10% chance of happening in the next year. Are there any particular things that you think are likely to happen in the next year that are like very high on your list of things that it would be great if this happened? And then also on the other side of that list that you'd be kind of terrified to see happen?
I think what would be great would be like this prediction we had around like an app or a product that's built by somebody with no coding ability, like goes viral and like sort of Flappy Bird ends up in like the top 100. Because I feel like that's so liberating and like cool. And I think we're already seeing snippets of this. and I sort of can't wait to see that happen. We'll just see way more cool things, and then like I think it'll also kind of unshackle the fact that consumers of big tech company products are victims of like the average user phenomenon, where like Google has to sell to the average person who uses Google Maps, not like the niche communities that use it in specific ways. And those people will never be catered for because they're not average and they can't edit it because they have no capabilities to do so. And now it's like, oh, you don't like that? Well, just build your own. And then, and like, obviously, what would be terrible is like the flip side of the things that I think are overhyped, which is like, yeah, like we do actually invent some like insane like biological system that's like super dangerous and like doesn't kill the person that makes it and is spread very easy and can go undetected. Like that would be pretty scary. I mean, we had one prediction around like a research paper written by like an agent or like an AI scientist would be accepted at a conference, and I think that would be like not scary, but I think it does call into question like not our ability to detect like fake stuff, because it doesn't mean a machine did it that it's fake or not of good quality, but it's sort of like, oh, maybe I'm not the best at this anymore for a community that's like used to being the ones that are architecting these things. So
The existential dread.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Maybe as a last question, what's on the horizon for Air Street for the next year? What are you excited about? What do you want to do this next year? Whereas like you mentioned a lot of stuff that kind of come to fruition this year in terms of things you've been thinking about. So what does that look like over the next few months, the next year?
Yeah. Well, I think a few things like excited about a lot of the in-person like community building we've been doing. Like we've been running like AI meetups in lots of cities like SF, New York, like Munich, Berlin, Paris, London, and that's been awesome. As everybody wants to meet like peers and learn from peers, and it's a great way for people to like learn best practices. So excited to kind of get back into the swing of that tour. I think there's some companies that are like reaching interesting inflection points, like Profluent and gene editing and Delian and defense and a few others. I try to constantly think about what is like the non-consensus thing today that eventually will be proven right, and I don't have like a super good answer to that yet. So still kind of pondering, and I think go back to another point. Like I'm just excited to try to meet problem owners, like product designers who are like inspired to build things with AI and can like kind of supercharge this whole like AI startup space into a new direction that's no longer kind of rate limited by what like AI research people think models can be useful for. And then yeah, and then I'm kind of looking forward to whatever ideas like I'll come up with during the year. I mean, I guess like what's kind of humbling, or a lot of things are humbling with investing, but one of the ones that continuously is that like there's no playbook for how to do this job right, because if there were one, everybody would use it and there'd be no value in it anymore. So you really do have to like think creatively about, how do I do something today that could like tee me up for finding something new in the future that would be exciting, and being the right person for whoever is the entrepreneur that's building against that opportunity. So in that sense, like we always try to do stuff that really like shows that we care about the domain more than anything else and want to be like contributors to it. So I'm sure I'll come up with other ideas of how to contribute, beyond trying to reform university spin-outs, trying to like reform government procurement of like AI systems, do state of AI, do Airstreet Press, do merch.
Yeah. The merch looks really solid. I'm excited to see more of what's coming out of Air Street this next year. I've been very closely following this year, so it's been good to see that grow. Well, I think this is a good place to close in. As always, Nathan, thank you for doing this. It's very fun to end the year with these. This is like always one of my favorite episodes to do.
Yeah, same.
And I appreciate the State of AI report. I appreciate Air Street. Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's great to have friends that I can share this with. So thank you for that.
As always, thank you for listening. Happy holidays. I do appreciate your feedback, comments, suggestions, compliments. If you have anything to say, I'm pretty easily reachable by Twitter, email, Substack, and I'd love to hear from you.